Hello, in this video, I want to continue and finish up the little two-part series that we've been doing talking about critical responses to Derrida and the way that we've been talking about how Derrida interacts with critiques as a whole. I really enjoyed doing this particular section of talking about Derrida in general because I think that it provided a really interesting spin to the way in which I had thought about the series going into it, because I wasn't really sure how I was going to take the critical section of these videos when I originally started talking about Derrida. But I think that it's a really interesting set of conversations to have in terms of what ways in which you can really expand the conversation that's currently being had. In typical ways, I think people are really resolving some of the key questions on the Academy K, and even some of the earlier thoughts that I had in previous YouTube videos versus the twist that I kind of want to put on it when thinking about Derrida becoming more involved and more prominent in the way that people are kind of like taking up the particular language that they're using to frame it, and how I think people respond to it as well. So if you haven't, make sure that you tune in to the last video that I did talking about the first portion of how critical teams respond to Derrida, because I think that's really important in terms of just framing like this video particularly, because they're in continuation of each other and sequenced in a way that they're really supposed to build on top of each other directly. But also tune into the rest of the series that I've done in terms of talking about the relationship that Derrida has to the K, better ways to execute it, because I think that learning from both ways can help you no matter like what relationship you really want to take to this argument. And I also think the intro to Derrida is just also good to have if you have no knowledge of Derrida at all and really want to have an understanding of some of the base assumptions or ideas that are kind of being thought about when I go into some of the advice that I'll be giving here. Because the first place that I really want to start off is just the link debate. I think that the link debate and how you should respond to it as a team trying to answer Derrida is like really interesting, because I think that it's really just a question of how effective you've been at being able to win some of these earlier framing questions. I think that once you won some of these earlier framing questions, or hopefully if you have, then from the last video where we talked about the way in which you can frame deconstruction as different from the process of how we come to the decision about whether or not which team like is able to get a ballot, and that is just a question of like the relationship that it has to the status quo. And I think that creating that barrier allows you to do two things in a world where you're winning this framing. First, I think it allows you to get really creative link turns in terms of explaining how when the affirmative and the alternative work collaboratively, or how the affirmative itself in the way that it is presented actually opens up the possibilities of resolving some of the way in which they're contending maybe some of the examples that you're leaning on and what those reparatives might look like. And I think that being able to give like examples of like reparatives and the kind of like difference between those and how they adapt to the present can be particularly important and helpful. But additionally, I think that another thing that you can do is really weigh like the kind of like things that are happening in the status quo as indicative of a world that can get much worse without the presence of the method of the affirmative. By this, I don't think that you need to necessarily frame it always as try or die, but rather a question of like how do we create conditions in which like revolution, or the way in which we can overtake these systems, and the conditions for such are more possible. And I think in that world, if you're able to push the method as a comparison between that and the current conditions available in the status quo, I think that you're at least able to pinch the alternative into being able to either resolve these questions, or being able to push in such a sense that just a simple refusal of the affirmative isn't enough, and the ability for them to really win like either an all-out presumption claim or a competitive claim methodologically, and the way that you're kind of like reframing the debate as a whole. I think that if you're much more worried about this debate, about the framing debate going south, and then you having to resolve the link debate still, I really think it's a question of you being able to lean even further onto this question of its relationship to the status quo, because I think that even if you're not able to win that the judge should use the status quo as a metric, being able to explain why the world could get worse and make it more impossible to kind of like have these conversations and to create like these kind of like tactical moments, I think can be a place where you like really place a lot of the kind of like defense that you would want. But I think the next thing that you have to do in order to turn on them is to like explain that like the idea that there can be a creation of a methodology that is disconnected from the baggage of like living in a world that we've already won is anti-black, is settler colonialism, capitalist, etc., is like an impossible like moral standard to hold. It doesn't allow us to continue to work generatively with the kind of like tools that are available to us, while still holding like a standard that allows us to create like better ways of like how we relate to each other, like within places of like the production of knowledge and outside of those. And I think that being able to kind of like lean on that as a different articulation for how the judge is able to think about the way in which the negative team is really kind of refining the arguments against you can just generally be helpful. And when you're moving into the permutation, I think that this is the place where you can like explain why the kind of strategies that are working with the affirmative and the negative are ways in which the 1AC is kind of like created or made better. But that doesn't mean that the 1AC as a framework for how we should think politically is necessarily bad, or that it doesn't allow us to think like strategically different about the status quo. And I think when you make that the metric for how the judge can kind of view the possibility of getting closer to the perm, I think there are a lot more ways in which you can build detailed examples, which allowed them to really envision the possibility of these two strategies working together. But I think in a world where the other team is kind of like using their framing strategy in order to create something that feels closer to like refusal, or something that feels like a hard rejection of the affirmative, I think that in the context of the permutation, you need to explain why refusal as a concept, or the kind of idea of like refusal in the context of this debate as deconstructive, could be useful in a world where you're kind of like winning that there is an overwhelming reason why there is like something generative to be done outside the capacity to like speak and think about the 1AC as a political project. But if the 1AC is kind of valuable in the terms that are being explained by the affirmative, then via the like possibility of those examples to become generative, then there is a necessary usage of spaces like debate in order to serve as places to like think about how like tactics are generated. I think this is like how you kind of weaponize what looks like the closest to like impact comparison on these pages, because I think that, like I've said before in other videos where I said that the impact comparison isn't really enough at the magnitude question, I think it is definitely a place where you can build in a lot of arguments about the kind of like plausibility of like our ability to create kind of an infrastructure that allows us to move closer towards like revolutionary planning, and the inability to do so if we are kind of like always held to like the standard of whether or not that methodology or framing is like perfect for its ability to kind of like change like every part of like what that structural system does, to make it hard for people to organize, to make it hard for people to communicate, to make it hard for there to be a way to break apart from like socializing processes that make and create the university as such a violent and pervasive source. And I think using that to kind of like flip a lot of the way in which they want to think about this debate onto them can be a really good place for you to respond to a lot of the advice that I've given a lot of other places. And I think also can be a good place for you to put a lot of pressure onto the alternative in terms of how it should be kind of resolving these questions in a world where like the kind of like magnitude of the impacts and things like that gets so big to a point where the connection between like this debate and the way in which it frames the outside world is both like harder to win in terms of like its uniqueness of like the university as a particular unique structure, but it's also like harder to win that there shouldn't be a way in which we should weight the very kind of like material consequences of how like the conversations that we have about these possible tactics affect our ability to like use them and build infrastrucures outside, and what the political framework should be for how we decide what like types of like political action should be like good or bad outside of the context of the particular debates that we're having. And I think in that context you can ask a lot of really interesting questions that can maybe change the way in which the negative could possibly oversimplify the framing and role in which they play in debate, and force them to like throw more nuance into the way in which the judge and the particular role that evaluation plays in the context of thinking about debate as kind of like a deconstructive activity, or however they're framing it in terms of Derrida. Hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into some of the other videos I'll be doing talking about Derrida, because like I said, I think it's a really interesting set of stuff to talk about for this particular resolution, and just I think something that shows up a lot in general. And so yeah, hopefully you'll keep tuning in for more. Thanks.